This is the Panama Canal, and BlackRock has just signed off on a $23 billion deal to take control of the canal's key ports. But what does this mean? Did the US just buy part of the Panama Canal? I'm going to tell you why this deal is so important and what's really driving this move. Is it just Trump? Maybe, but BlackRock has its own reasons for this deal, which we'll get into later. Let me explain. The first question anyone should ask is, why does this deal matter? We're talking about the Panama Canal, an 82-kilometer long channel that cuts across the Americas, linking the Atlantic with the Pacific. But despite the short distance, it's critical to global trade, as it's estimated that every year around 5% of all global maritime trade passes through this small canal. This equates to around $270 billion in cargo crossing Panama every year, and it's the US for which it's most important. 40% of all US container traffic travels through the Panama Canal. The US is the largest user of the Panama Canal, making up around 73% of the canal's traffic. US maritime trade is obviously very dependent on it, so it's understandable that the US wants to have control over it and not let anyone else pull the strings. And this leads quite well to the current situation. Donald Trump has made multiple comments about the Panama Canal and the lack of control the US has over it.
The Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. China!
But what's actually going on here? Is China secretly controlling the canal? Let's unpack that by looking at who controlled the canal before and how the control shifted between countries. The canal's construction was first attempted by the French, but it didn't turn out successful and was only partially completed. The US had interest in the Panama Canal project, and so in 1903, the US bought the rights to the canal, finishing its construction in 1914. The canal was under US control until 1977, when President Jimmy Carter signed the Torrijos-Carter treaties to eventually give Panama control over the canal, and so in 1999, Panama assumed full control over it. It might be interesting to also mention that the Neutrality Treaty, one of the two Torrijos-Carter treaties, specified that the canal should remain permanently neutral and the US has the right to defend the canal from any threat to this neutrality. This will be useful to remember for later. Now fast forward to the present, and we have Trump saying China is operating the canal. Taking this statement at face value, it's false. There is no public evidence to even suggest that China is controlling the canal instead of Panama. The Panamanian president, José Raúl Molino, responded to this claim, saying the canal is and will continue to be Panama's. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson also responded to this, saying China has no control over the running of the canal. So then, where is this idea of China controlling the canal coming from? It actually comes from the significant presence of Chinese investments and companies there. Over the past decade, China has been expanding its influence in Panama. Back in 2017, Panama cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan and established relations with China, a big win for China. A few months later, Panama became the first Latin American country to join China's signature Belt and Road Initiative, the trillion-dollar global infrastructure initiative designed to expand China's economic reach. China also opened its first Confucius Institute in Panama. These institutes are public programs of the state of China aimed to promote Chinese language and culture. Chinese companies have also sponsored media training for Panamanian journalists. It's quite obvious China didn't waste time making their presence felt, especially when you take into account that both private and state-owned Chinese companies have poured billions of dollars in investments into infrastructure projects in Panama, including a cruise terminal and a bridge to be built over the canal. And crucial to the current situation, CK Hutchison, a Hong Kong-based conglomerate, operates 2 of the 5 ports at either end of the canal, Balboa and Cristobal. To be clear, CK Hutchison is not owned by China, but because it's based in Hong Kong, it still operates under Chinese financial laws, and that's enough to raise concerns in the US. After all, these ports don't just handle cargo, they collect valuable data on what's passing through, where it's headed, and who's shipping it. And in an era where supply chains are battlegrounds, that's information the US doesn't want in the wrong hands. That kind of information regarding cargo would be very useful in the event of a supply chain war. It's this type of involvement that likely fueled Trump's claim that the canal is owned by China. And while CK Hutchison doesn't own the canal, its presence in Panama is significant enough to cause political ripples, especially when you consider that in 2021, it secured a no-bid 25-year extension on its port contract, meaning that the contract was awarded to them without going through a competitive bidding process. Not surprising though, this deal is now under review. Since taking office in 2024, Panama's new president I mentioned earlier, Molina, promised to clean up past corruption, and part of that means auditing CK Hutchison's port contract. The contract has been criticized for lacking transparency and not generating much benefit for Panama's economy. Panama's Attorney General has even called the concession unconstitutional. So far, it does look like CK Hutchison and China have tried to overpower the US in Panama. But I think it's worth mentioning that the US hasn't had that much of an interest in Panama until recently. Back when CK Hutchison won its original contract, there was barely any competition. Andrew Thomas, a professor who studied the canal, pointed out that the US at the time didn't really care about these ports, and Hutchison faced no objection. On top of that, despite their strategic locations, these ports aren't essential for crossing the canal. There are also other ports in Panama, operated by companies from Taiwan, Singapore, and the US. Nevertheless, a deal to buy the port was signed, and this is where it starts to get even more interesting. To be clear, the deal still needs approval from Panama to finalize, but this is the deal as it stands now. CK Hutchison Holding announced it would sell all its shares in two of its subsidiaries, Hutchison Port Holdings and Hutchison Port Group Holdings. These two subsidiaries hold 80% of the Hutchison Ports Group, which operates 43 ports in 23 countries, two of them being the two major Panama ports mentioned earlier. This is not just a deal for two ports in Panama. We're talking about 43 ports. It's no wonder this deal is valued at a whopping $22.8 billion. And who's gonna buy it? A group of companies, also known as a consortium, comprised of BlackRock, Global Infrastructure Partners, and Terminal Investment Limited. What's more interesting than the sheer size of the deal is the fact that they kind of overpaid, and by a lot. The port assets have been previously valued at $10.5 billion, which means that CK Hutchison sold it to the BlackRock Group for more than double that. Why the insanely high price? Well, given the growing political tensions surrounding these ports, especially the ones in Panama, it's clear they're worth more in the buyer's hands than they were in Hutchison's, and by selling, Hutchison can also avoid being caught in political turmoil. Okay, that makes sense, but what exactly are these ports worth for BlackRock? Why would they want to get this deal done? What reasons do they have? The main reason is to invest in infrastructure assets. See, these types of assets are incredibly lucrative. BlackRock itself has described them as resilient, profitable, and well protected against inflation. And this isn't just a one-off move. The company has been aggressively expanding into infrastructure, recently spending over $27 billion acquiring firms focused on energy, transportation, and logistics. And that's where Global Infrastructure Partners comes in. GIP is part of this consortium that's buying the ports, and BlackRock actually acquired GIP last year. BlackRock bet that its status as the world's largest asset manager, with its extensive government and investment relationships, combined with GIP's experience, would open doors to infrastructure deals that other firms simply couldn't handle. This purchase of CK's ports is part of that strategy, theoretically allowing BlackRock to leverage GIP's shipping experience to maximize the value of these assets. In other words, BlackRock isn't just buying ports, it's betting on a global infrastructure empire that can outmaneuver its competitors. But there's a bit more to this deal than just money. BlackRock has been under fire in recent years, targeted by the Republican Party for woke investing. Republicans expressed concerns about whether BlackRock's massive holdings in US corporations force companies to adopt environmental, social, and governance standards. Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, has in the past called for corporations to play an active role in increasing diversity in their workforces. And now, the firm is quietly backing away from those policies, scrubbing DEI commitments from its reports and becoming more aligned with the Trump administration. Is this deal part of that shift? A way to rebuild ties with the Trump administration? And then there's the geopolitical angle. Removing Chinese influence is only part of Trump's demands on Panama. He's also pushing for US vessels to be able to cross the canal without paying tolls. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, during his visit to Panama, called it absurd that the US should have to pay fees in a zone it is obligated to protect, referring to the neutrality treaty I mentioned earlier. Overall, even though BlackRock did seem to overpay on paper, it does look like this deal is an overall win for the US. But what does that mean for Panama? I think it's obvious Panama is entering a new phase. Its strategic location means that it can easily get caught in the middle of a trade war. It'll be interesting to see how Panama will handle its relationship between China and the US. China has poured billions into its economy, but the US is starting to get more involved as well. It must manage US and Chinese interests, all while preserving its sovereignty and economic independence. Panama is essentially balancing on a tightrope, only that the tightrope isn't even fixed. If you enjoyed this video, YouTube thinks you'll enjoy this one too. See you next time.